two stories that provide a good backdrop to our gospel reading today. The first is actually not a story, it's a joke, and it's one of my favorite jokes. If it's not my favorite joke, it's at least in the top 5 of my favorite jokes. And since it's one of my favorites, I might have used it before, but as I said, it provides a good backdrop, so here I go. A man is stranded on a desert island for many, many years, but finally he's rescued. When his rescuers arrive, they see that he's built 3 huts. And so they ask him about it, and he says, well, the first hut is my house, and the second hut is my church. And that made sense to him. They said, well, what about the third hut? He said, oh, that's the church I used to go to. Now think about that for a while I tell you the second one. Anglican priest Father John Mbiti is a theologian and philosopher from Kenya in Africa. Born in 1931 to Christian parents in Kenya, he was steeped in the Christian faith. He grew up to be a scholar, and in his seminal work, African Religions and Philosophy, Father Mbiti introduces the theological concept of Ubuntu, gathered from one of the African religions that he had studied. The concept of Ubuntu sums up the African concept of community. Ubuntu means I am because we are. I am because we are. It's only in community that we exist. Community happens first, and then it shows us who we are as individuals. I am because we are. If someone in the community is wounded, until they reach some kind of reconciliation, the community cannot be whole. I am because we are. Today's gospel ends with the words, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. And that should provide us with a great deal of comfort and peace, kind of a warm, fuzzy feeling all over. When 2 or 3 of us are gathered together, we can be sure that Jesus is there. Kind of makes you feel like singing Kumbaya, doesn't it? Now, kids, you need to ask your parents what Kumbaya is, or maybe your grandparents at this point. But the beginning of the gospel is not about peace at all. It's not all warm and fuzzy. The gospel begins with Jesus talking about division and conflict and sin. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him the fault between you and him alone. I laugh every time I think of Jesus saying, if your brother sins against you, because I think it needs to be when your brother sins against you. Conflicts happen. People hurt people who hurt people who hurt people. It happens in families. It happens in the workspace. It happens among friends. It happens with neighbors. And it happens even in the best of churches. And yes, it happens here at JP2. The question isn't if we are going to have conflict and hurt in our lives, but when we have conflict and hurt in our lives. And Jesus tells us that when we have conflicts, especially among our brothers and sisters in the church, there's a specific way that we should handle it. He gives us a 4-step process, and I'd like to take a little closer look at those steps, because I would imagine that if we handle the conflicts the way Jesus instructs us to, I think we have a higher probability of resolution. The first step Jesus outlines is go and tell him his faults between you and him alone. So the first step isn't go and put it on Facebook. The first step isn't go and talk to your best friend about what he or she did. The first step isn't keep it inside so that in time it will blow over. The first step is to go and point out the fault between him and you alone. Perhaps the most interesting thing about that first step is that when we are hurt by someone, we are to go to that person, not out of anger, not out of pain, but to regain our brother or sister, to offer that person the opportunity for reconciliation so that community will not be lost. The person who has done the hurting may or may not know the extent of the injury. It's the task of the one who has been hurt to share that with him or her, and then to welcome him or her back into community, not to run away, not to shun, not to ignore, but to be reconciled. I am because we are. But what if reconciliation doesn't occur? What are we to do next? The second step Jesus gives us is this: if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, so that every fact may be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. This is not a question of ganging up on someone, but of quiet, humble concern. I can't tell you the number of times when something's going on in the parish and someone says to me, "Father, I'm not the only one who feels this way. A lot of people are talking about this." And my response is almost always the same: "Well, a lot of people haven't said anything to me." How might this second conversation sound? Now remember, you've already spoken to the person individually. I think it could sound like this: "I know you don't really understand what hurt your actions caused, and so I asked Bill and Mary here to come with me today, because what you did hurt all of us." Remember, the purpose here is not to prove who's right and who's wrong, but to make the community whole once again. I am because we are. Next, Jesus tells us that if these 2 steps fail, refer it to the church. Now, Jesus is assuming, I think here, that this is an internal conflict among members of the body of Christ. So he says, refer it to the church. This would be the time that you might come to me or another member of the pastoral team or someone else you know to be a devoted follower of Jesus and seek insight and direction. Now, if you come to me, the first thing I'm going to ask you is this: what have you done yourself to solve the issue? I'm going to be listening to hear if you've done something along the lines of step 1 and 2 that Jesus give us. Have you spoken to that person individually? Have you asked others to speak with you to that person? Are you following the pathway that Jesus laid out for us in Matthew's gospel? And if you have, then together we can look for a possible solution. Because our goal, once again, is not to prove who's right and who's wrong, but to find a path to reconciliation. I am because we are. And if there's no path to reconciliation, then Jesus gives us a 4th step. Treat them as you would a tax collector or a Gentile. Now, you need to ask yourself this question: how did Jesus treat tax collectors and Gentiles? He always treated them with kindness and respect, even if they did not follow his ways. You know, there have been any number of times in my 30-plus years of being a pastor that people have left the parish because of something that I've done. Some have come to me and pointed out why they were leaving, and I've always respected them more when they do so. But most of them I simply hear by way of the grapevine that they've left, and it's my fault. My hope is that when I encounter them again, that I do so with kindness and respect, always leaving open the possibility of them returning to our parish. I am because we are. My friends, Jesus tells us today what to do when we're in conflict with someone. 4 steps. Number 1, talk to them first yourself. Number 2, take along 1 or 2 others. Number 3, refer it to the church. And number 4, if all else fails, treat them as you would a tax collector or a Gentile, remembering how Jesus treated tax collectors and Gentiles. It's not an easy path, but it is a path that can lead to peace and reconciliation. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is always in the midst of them.